So, why is Edward Cullen a bad news lover? Maybe it's because he's a vampire. Look, I know that we live in progressive times and everything, but I feel like my hard boundary is if you are a literal monster, a blood-sucking monster. And now that I have pissed off the entire Twilight fandom, let's begin this video. So I'd like to preface this by saying that the study of vampires and the sexual threat that they pose to people in society, male and female, is an entire field of study to itself. If you go on, say, Google Scholar or something and just be like, vampire, sex, although I don't really recommend that you do that unless you want Google to have some very interesting ideas about you. But hypothetically, if you were to do that, then there would be a million articles about not just Twilight, but also everything from like Dracula onwards. If you go back in time and you look at the myth of Dracula, I mean, it's a very old myth, but in the 19th century in Victorian England, the myth of Dracula, as Bram Stoker wrote it, really fed into a very specific type of fear. There was a book that came out rather recently about the state of sexuality in Victorian England and how it was so much different than what we think of, because we think of it as something being rigid and sober and repressive. And while it was all those things, the thing is that people were still people. And just because they couldn't express themselves or be themselves, it didn't mean that it all went away. So in fact, what happened was in Victorian England, the morality and sexuality sort of really warped. And there was a lot of really weird, kinky, fetishy things going on in England at the time. And I can't remember the name of the book, but I'm going to try and see if I can find it, and I'll put it up here so you can go check it out yourself. And one of the things that Victorians were obsessed with was the idea of this vampire, someone who was alive yet dead and who literally fed off the youth and beauty and vitality of pure young people, male and female. But as times changed and society evolved and sexuality kind of eased and restrictions faded away, the way that we look at vampires also changed. And throughout the 20th century, you'll see that slowly turning and changing until we arrive in the 21st century with the vampire as just another misunderstood little boy. Because that's what Edward Cullen is, right? He is a forever 18 or 19-year-old, forever youthful, forever beautiful, forever tortured by this life that he didn't ask for. Even the nature of himself as a monster is really presented in terms that we would use for people who are battling with their darker side. So at this point, he's not even a human. Like, vampires are not human. They come of human stock, but they're not human, they're monsters. But in this particular idea of vampires, and I'm not just talking about Twilight, I'm talking about all the vampire fiction that you might have read over the past 20-30 years. And I've read a lot of them, so I know what I'm talking about. This idea of a quote-unquote vegetarian vampire, which is a term that cracks me up. But the idea of a vegetarian vampire rests on the assumption that their need for blood, for human blood, particularly the blood of virgins, is something that they can battle within themselves, and it's really just like being addicted to, I don't know, cocaine or something. Are you an alcoholic? Have you been able to say no to another drink? Well, so can your friendly vampire. All he needs is the love of a good woman who believes in him. Now, back in Victorian times, part of the threat of vampires was also that they were foreign. Can't trust those foreign types. They're bloodsuckers, you know, literally. But as we move into the 21st century, the other has been defanged. So we still have the concept of the other and we still find them a threat, but we also sexualize them and exoticize them. And really, the genius of Stephenie Meyer's is that she really perfected an idea that was already sort of floating around in popular culture. The idea of a beautiful vampire who fits into human society and is just really a rich playboy with an alternative lifestyle. But so much for Edward Cullen being a vampire. Let's talk about who he is as a character. First off, he's a 100-year-old virgin. That's not a good sign. In fact, I would say that's a red flag, personally. I know it's supposed to show that he has self-control and that he is really built for finer things, but I'm just thinking, what's wrong with this guy? And you don't have to wonder too long because he'll come out and show you what's wrong with him. Ladies, if you're ever dating a guy who breaks into your house to watch you sleep, that guy is not the guy. If he can't communicate using his actual adult words and instead just runs away from you all the time, every time things look even slightly difficult, and I'm not even talking about the very difficult conversation that Bella and Edward need to have about the fact that, he would like to eat her, and not in a fun way. I mean, like all the other stuff too, Even after they're a couple and she knows the truth about him and his family, he still can't say more than 2 words to her. This is a person that you want to spend eternity with? What does that look like? You just stare at each other in increasing intensity for the rest of time? I don't know, maybe that appeals to a bunch of people. You do you. Next, he sparkles, which means that you can't really take him anywhere. I mean, sure, you can't take him out in sunlight, but also, what if you take him someplace there are bright lights? You're at the football game and nobody can see well enough to play because your boyfriend is blinding all the players and the viewers. But it's fine, you'd never take him to a game because he has no social skills. And before you come at me and you're like, well, of course he doesn't have any social skills. He had to be close to his family and make sure that he didn't get close to any humans in case they figured it out. I'd like to point out that there are other very popular vampire series that are set in the 20th and 21st century where the vampires are actually able to communicate and have meaningful relationships with humans, or even just interact with them like normal people, which, by the way, is probably the better way to elude suspicion. If you told me there was a vampire in my vicinity and asked me to guess who it was, I would never guess that it's this popular dude who goes to all the keg parties and is friends with everybody. But I would absolutely look at Edward and be like, oh, that's a vampire. Because he acts like a vampire all the time. The Cullens must have chosen to stay in that little town because it's populated by idiots. And on top of all this, he'll make out with you, but he won't have sex with you because he's afraid that he'll break you in half because he's super strong. And so in order to have a life with him, you need to become a monster. I'm sorry, but that is insane. I know I'm supposed to find it romantic, but I think that if you have to become a monster in order to be with somebody else, then that person is really not worth it. I don't care how pretty they are, I don't care how much they sparkle, I don't care if they're intoxicated by the scent of me. I'm not becoming a monster. Although of course, Bella becomes, the most graceful monster ever. But we're not gonna go into that. That's the kind of thing that gets Stephenie Meyer's hate mail from people who read her books. And of course, as I mentioned in my sex and shopping video, Edward is basically the grandfather of all these books in which the man is a hugely controlling piece of crap. He is obsessed with the clothes that she wears, he is obsessed with her diet. Although honestly, that story would have been a lot more interesting if he had been spending that much time worried about her because he was sort of racing her to his dietary specifications. You know how they race Kobe beef? They give them little massages and feed them beer. It would have been like super funny if he was grooming her, but like not for sex, but a meal. What I find especially funny about Edward Cullen is that he didn't just screw up a lot of young women's ideas of what is romantic versus what is abusive, but he also screwed up the lives of the people who played him. Well, there's only been one person who's played him, as Robert Pattinson, but it kind of really left a fairly incredible imprint upon his life. I mean, up to this day, there are people out there, grown women, middle-aged women, who are convinced that our Pats is married to Case Stu and that they have kids. And it's all a secret for like reasons. And she's just pretending to be bi, and he is just pretending to be with like a succession of really interesting women. And eventually one day they will reveal themselves and their happy little family. This is a 100% real thing, and I cannot imagine what it must feel like to be Robert Pattinson and to deal with that level of crazy. And if one of you is watching this video, I'm very sorry, I didn't mean to say anything. Please leave me alone. Now that the new book has come out, I am absolutely expecting a reboot of the series, and it'll probably have like, you know, something more focused on Edward perhaps. And I'm really interested to see how they're going to cast that person. Because in a weird way, Edward Cullen is more a collection of ideas than of like personality. And because Robert Pattinson played him for the first time and he was such a grand success in that role, I kind of can't imagine anyone else in it. And his interpretation of that character is pretty much who I imagine Edward to be in my head. And Pattinson is a very fine actor, but what we see on screen of Edward is basically a blank slate. He's basically a delivery system for pretty much anything or any emotion that you are trying to get out of that particular archetype. A rich, powerful man who wishes to control you because he is so much in love with you. I have a lot of ideas, but I'm not exactly sure how to articulate them at this moment about that particular trope. And my hope is that by the end of this series, I'll have a better grasp on my thoughts and how I feel about it, because it is an enduring trope, isn't it? If you look at all the men that I have discussed up to this point, a big part of them is the fact that they are obsessed with either the women in their lives or with something or the other. They all have an obsessive personality. And I guess you'll just have to come back to see if that is a trope that persists for the rest of this list. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.